line will be seen in its entirety following this Eyewitness News special report.
Good evening once again, and welcome to the special report on what we are calling Fire on the Mall.
Well, actually, we don't know yet by what name this fire will be remembered, but we do know that in terms of the dollar amount of the damage, this fire will be called the worst in the city's history. The damage estimate now stands at $30 million, most of that to the Northwestern Bank complex.
There have, of course, been some other huge fires in the Twin Cities. In fact, way back in 1893, a fire that started on Nicollet Island destroyed more than 100 buildings and razed 23 blocks of the city. More recently, in February of 1978, 2 explosions and a fire tore through the Commodore Hotel, claiming no lives but injuring 71. And a year later, an explosion on the first floor of the Metropolitan Medical Center gutted the first 3 floors. Again, no deaths there. There, in late 1980, a fire that started in Mousie's Bar on Hennepin Avenue spread up into the Hennepin Hotel, forcing 60 residents out into the November cold and claiming 1 life. Earlier this year, 30 residents of the Richmond apartments in downtown Minneapolis were forced out of their homes, and 100 firefighters from St. Paul fought a downtown fire last March, destroying the offices of the Helper Box Company and many other tenants. Damages eventually there passed the $1 million mark.
And this was not the first fire at Donaldson's either. A 5-alarm fire back in 1970 caused $1 million damage, mostly from smoke and water. And another downtown department store, Powers, has seen 2 major fires. One in 1976 that caused $4 million in damage, and a 1963 fire that closed the store down for 3 weeks and cost the store 3/4 of its inventory. And, of course, the last big fire in downtown Minneapolis destroyed several businesses, most notably Duff's Restaurant on Christmas Eve, 1978. Several $1 million in damage, only 1 minor injury. The Thanksgiving Day fire on the mall is now. This should give you an idea of just where the fire was in downtown Minneapolis. As you can see, it was right in the middle of things, surrounded by the IDS complex, the new City Center complex, housing the new Donaldson's and J.C. Penney's. Before long, a damage estimate of $30 million had surfaced, and firefighters still on the scene. Stan?
Well, many of those firefighters and their supervisors have been out there a long time. Supervising those still on the scene right now at this hour, they are still there in great numbers, is Deputy Chief Lawrence Moskalak, and with him our colleague Dennis Bounds. Dennis?
Behind the barricade. Chief, first of all, we're going to get a little overview as to what happened the last 24 hours. Chief, you have been on the scene just about all of that time, with the exception of a little sleep. First of all, how did this fire rage out of control so quickly and so easily?
Well, it started in the rubble of the demolished Donaldson's building, and it got going so good so fast and went in through the windows of the Northwest National Bank building. And it was on so many floors that it was no way we could handle it all at once.
Okay, you were here when the inferno was literally raging. When the fire department did get on the scene, what was the plan of strategy? How did you lay the troops to put the fire out?
Well, the first companies tried to just put out the fire in the rubble, and when it was determined that that wasn't going to help much, then we went into the building, into the bank building, and tried to keep the fire from coming in. And by the time we were able to get into there, the fire was in the windows, and it was already beyond the point where we could control it. So we had to back out of the building and control the fire from outside, and then re-enter the building a couple hours later.
A fire of this type is very unusual right in the center of city. Any special equipment that the department put to use?
Well, we used our water towers. That's our aerial ladders that'll go up 100 feet with a nozzle on the end, and that way we can fight the fire on the higher levels through the windows to hold it until we can go inside to fight it.
How many ladders were you using with those nozzles?
Well, at any one time yesterday, I think the most we had was about 4 going.
And you also had nozzles, if I do recall, because I was on top of the Cargill building, were nozzles placed in any other of the tall buildings around the area?
Yeah, we had them on the Cargill building and on the Marquette Inn, and we also had men on top of the F&M Bank.
Okay, Deputy Chief Larry Moskalik, we appreciate you being with us. I know you have to go back to work and put in a long shift tonight. Thank you very much. back to the studio.
All right, thank you very much, Dennis. A question that a lot of people were asking today, is my money okay? That was a question, actually, that was on the minds of more than one person, and the answer was yes. Northwestern National Bank did business almost all as usual at its Skyway office and its 6 branches today. Money specialist Dennis Moore explains how the bank coped with the crisis from the moment the fire began last night.
Well, we were about to sit down. In fact, I was carving the turkey when a telephone call came, and like many of these things, you get a call, and I assumed that there was a smoldering fire in one of the laboratories or wherever it may be. It was inconsequential, but I was told that it probably wasn't.
As the fire burned, Armstrong and 50 or 60 other executives met across the street in the bank's Cargill building offices. This morning, they were at it again, putting a 4-inch thick recovery plan into operation, figuring out how to get 1,500 people working together again.
I was very impressed by the people rallying around the flag as they responded to a crisis situation.
Northwestern is insured for the replacement cost of everything lost in the fire, and Armstrong says the disaster won't be a big financial blow. Northwestern Bank was as lucky in its way as Lindbergh, not just because the Jenny is safe despite the devastation upstairs, but because the computer that's the heart of a modern bank, well, that's in another building. The Northwestern Bank Operations Center, 4 blocks away, holds the computers that keep all the bank's account and business records. The check processing and money transfer equipment is here, too, and the people who handle customer problems and questions. They kept the bank in business almost as usual today. And although some of the executives, money managers, loan officers working at Cargill today have lost years of personal records in the fire, Jim Armstrong says they'll be back in business as usual, too, as soon as he can find offices for them.
We've had offers from our competitors, from the Federal Reserve Bank, from the Minnesota Bankers Association, from a number of corporations who have space, some individuals who have offered space to us in their homes or whatever it might be for office space.
No one knows when or if this bank will open again, but when the smoke clears, Armstrong says one good thing may come out of the fire. The way people are rallying around the bank on the morning after, says he wouldn't be surprised if business actually got better. In Minneapolis, I'm Dennis Moore, Channel 5 Eyewitness News.
The law firm of Faegre & Benson, which is one of the largest in this state, was the biggest tenant in the bank building, occupying 4 floors, the upper reaches of that building. Their offices have been destroyed, but a spokesman for the firm says that they do have duplicates or computer storage of their important documents. Now, the firm plans to rent office space in another building and should be back in business as early as next week. One of the firm's partners said that the most important thing, of course, was that nobody was killed. Had the fire broke out on a workday, well, it could have been a entirely different ending to that story.
On another angle of this, Minnesota is one of 4 states that does not allow cities to adopt more restrictive fire codes than what the state has. Rochester is the only city in the state that has managed to circumvent the law. They've claimed that tough regulations are needed there because of the number of physically disabled people in the city seeking medical care. Now, you might think that building owners would naturally want the most sophisticated fire detection and prevention systems, if only to reduce the risk of fire and lower the insurance rate. That turns out to be not always the case.
And Cindy, predictably, I guess, whenever there's a fire of this magnitude, the question is invariably asked, could it have been prevented? Well, we know now, for instance, that there is no sprinkler system in the upper floors of the Northwestern Bank building, something required in new construction. And joining us is Hugh Strawn, a man who wears a couple of hats. He is vice chairman of the Governor's Council on Fire Prevention and Control, and an organization formed 10 years ago, and an organization that likes to think of itself as leaders, really, among those who think fires and how to prevent those fires. He's also vice president of the Minnesota Insurance Information Center, and that is an organization which is designed to translate the language of the insurance industry, sometimes very difficult to translate, into English for us lay people. In any case, a man who knows a lot about fires and has some experience himself as a news reporter. Hugh, thanks for joining us tonight. We have been warned, those collectively in the community here, about a fire along the lines of this one, have we not?
That's correct. About a year and a half ago, the Minneapolis Fire Department's chief officers went before the city council and said that if they had a high-rise fire start in downtown Minneapolis, it may possibly get beyond their ability to handle it. And this happened last night. They asked at that time for assistance in the form of an ordinance which would require sprinklers, alarm systems, special stairways, things like that, to help make a building resist a fire better. And that matter was turned over to a task force created by the City Council and is being studied at this time.
At this time, how much time is necessary for study?
I don't know. There are a number of people that are looking at it, insurance industry, building owners, fire service people. They've received an ordinance out of the request that gives them a licensing procedure involving sprinkler companies and sprinkler fitters, so they have some control over the quality of systems that go in.
But has there been opposition to it? Has anyone come forward and say, no, it's too expensive or it's impractical, it can't be done?
Well, there's been that, and there's also been a great deal of support for it, too. But you have that in a democracy with a give and take when you're dealing with a free system.
How does the insurance industry rate the city of Minneapolis as being fire safe?
The insurance industry has a classification that's a guideline that's created by the Insurance Services Office, and they rate cities on a scale of 1 to 10, and 10 being the least number you'd like to have, and 1 being absolutely the very best. And Minneapolis has a rating of 3, which is pretty good.
And what about St. Paul, for reference?
That also has a rating of 3.
Back to the subject of the fire itself, before I was asking you, how does a demolished building burn so quickly? What was in there? You're assuming that the furnishings are gone. Would there have been wooden studs in a building that was an department store? Would have been mostly concrete.
In this particular building, there was a great deal of it that was timber construction. It was a very old building. And once you start to dismantle a building, you remove the sprinklers, you remove the plaster, you remove the vertical enclosures that prevent a fire from spreading up, you remove the horizontal enclosures that prevent it from spreading horizontally, and you have a large open building, a big pile of kindling. And this
fire trap, in other words, when you demolish a building.
And this is what happened last night, and the fire spread very quickly.
Hugh, this business of older buildings not being legally bound to have sprinkler systems in them, what about an incentive to those buildings where their insurance premiums would be reduced?
Well, that does occur in some buildings, not in office buildings. Office buildings aren't considered a real hazard by the insurance industry as opposed to, say, a lumber yard or something like that. But an incentive that is being considered, and at least being talked about amongst the people in the Governor's Council, is a tax break for installing a fire suppression or an automatic alarm system. Right now, if you were to spend $1 million to put a sprinkler system in your building in Minnesota, you'd be taxed for that $1 million improvement, and that's a disincentive. And so a proposal similar to something that's been created in Alaska probably will be forthcoming in Minnesota that will say that is no tax available to be, a property tax available to be placed on a fire suppression or detection system in a building.
The fire in the bank building started on the upper floors, the 6th or 7th level up there. This again raises the question of what good are these high rangers, these so-called cherry pickers that bring the firemen up in buckets. They only go so high, and they're virtually useless, are they not, in a fire like that?
Well, in a fire that high, yes, they are. The ladder company in a fire department is designed to do many things, not necessarily get the ladder up to the highest point and rescue people. They do a lot of ventilation work. They do a lot of forcible entry work. They support the engine company people who are using the hoses to suppress the fire. The problem is, if that building had been occupied with the fire spreading as fast as it did, that there could very easily have been fatalities in the building, as Chief Wold indicated tonight on your 10 o'clock newscast.
Thank you very much.
Couldn't have laddered them.
One quick question before we wrap up. How many other buildings are there, say, just on the Nicollet Mall that do not have sprinkler systems, that people are going in through every day thinking, well, if a fire breaks out here, I'll be safe?
I don't know, to tell you the truth. I know in the block right around that building, most of the structures, with the exception of Dayton's and City Center, did not have sprinklers.
All right. Again, thank you, Mr.
Thanks,
Struck. Now, when we come back after this break, we're going to take a look at how the fire affected Dayton.
Stay away. But as Libby Znaimer reports here, the crowds were as big as usual.
By mid-morning, it was clear that last night's fire was not driving the crowds away from the Nicollet Mall. On the contrary, many people said they were shopping here so they could have a look at the damage. That was a surprise to both store owners and some of the shoppers.
We thought maybe some people wouldn't come downtown because of the fire, so we thought we could get down here, it wouldn't be as crowded.
This woman was shopping in a store that managed to stay open despite its proximity to the fire. It was lucky that the Bediner Jewelers in the IDS have a door on the street. The owners still haven't assessed the extent of the smoke damage here, but the traffic was steady in spite of the smoke and the lack of heat.
Yes, it'll be quieter. It'll be down. the jewelry on this side of the building. Lucky the wind was the other way, but it could have been worse.
The downtown council also said it could have been worse. The shops in the IDS will lose money because they had to stay closed. But some stores like Dayton's reported that sales were actually higher than last year. Other merchants were holding steady, and that's a lot more than they hoped for when they opened their doors this morning. Libby Znaimer, Channel 5 Eyewitness News, Minneapolis.
Now, a trip downtown to shop is an occasional event for many of the people who were there today, and for lots of those people, of course, the fire was just an added attraction. But for the thousands of others who work downtown and make that trip every day, the fire, while still a spectacle, was a major inconvenience. Here's Marcia Fleur.
Early today, the streets nearest the fire were smoke-shrouded and eerie. Police had erected barricades around the perimeter of the fire to keep out the traffic, and those who walked to work from parking lots outside the fire zone found the streets seamed with fire hoses and slick with ice. And many found when they got to work that they'd made the trip for nothing. IDS employees were turned back by a sign in the lobby.
The two different radio stations I was listening to said, come down, IDS's offices are open, and then we get here and our offices are closed.
My boss and I were the only ones supposed to be working, and he was here and left too, I guess. I haven't spoke with him.
When do you think you'll be able to come back to work?
I presume Monday, hopefully. I've got a lot to do.
Did you know about the fire?
Yes, but they didn't say anything about Woolworths being closed. Was I watching the wrong channel?
Others with offices in the IDS tower thought they could remain open today, but found the air too polluted.
Well, I was just up in the IDS tower, and all the way on the 22nd floor, there's smoke in there.
It's affecting everybody downtown today?
Well, I'm not going to stay and work in the office this morning. It's too smoky.
That's pretty bad. What else?
Even for those as high up as the 46th floor of the IDS tower, enough smoke had found its way into the offices to make working unpleasant. And many said if it got any worse, they'd call it a day and give the air some time to clear. Except for the people we talked to who work in the Northwestern Bank building, most people hope to be back at work Monday morning. This is Marcia Fleur, Channel 5 Eyewitness News in Minneapolis.
So, Thanksgiving Day, 1982, will now go down as the day of the big fire in downtown Minneapolis. If anywhere near the initial damage estimates hold true, the fire will have been by far the most destructive blaze in the city's history. And for many of the companies inside the heavily damaged Northwest Bank building, the fire has caused tremendous problems. For others in this downtown area, only temporary inconvenience. A fire of this size could easily have resulted in deaths, but it did not. And everyone is thankful that most of the injuries suffered by the firefighters who fought the blaze were only minor. Fire officials know where the blaze began, but they don't yet know how. Arson investigators are now piecing together the various leads, working on the suspicion at least that it may have been set. But the investigators themselves admit that often the causes of fires like this are never really discovered. And Cindy, having been out there with those firefighters, I want to take this opportunity to thank them for their splendid cooperation. The assistant chiefs taking time to help us keep you up to date on a very important major story. And the firefighters, the guys on the line, did a tremendous job. They did it without any serious injury because they are skillful, knowledgeable people. They don't take foolish risks. They're well led, and, well, they just turned in a marvelous job.
And as you suggested, there's much more to be reported on this story. For example, what caused it? For that, you will please join us, we hope, for later editions of Eyewitness News. But that just about wraps up this special report. Please stay tuned for Nightline. And again, good night.
Good night.